In the second chapter of the Eudemian Ethics, Aristotle offers some extraordinary advice, and this is the first item on your handout. Everyone who has the power to live by their own decision ought to set up for himself some target for living finely, be it honor or reputation or wealth or education, which they will look to in the performance of all their actions, since not organizing one's life in relation to some end is a mark of great foolishness. Now, what I find so extraordinary is that Aristotle thinks that there's a right answer to the question what we should establish as the ultimate goal in life. But the options he mentions in this passage, honor, reputation, wealth, education, are not that answer. Now, it's clear that Aristotle thinks we would do better to aim at the right target. In the very next sentence, he will urge us to take time to reflect and figure out what the best goal is. Still, before getting to that, his advice, whether explicit or implicit, there's some question about the text here, but in either case, it's clear that he's giving advice. His advice is just to pick something and establish it as the target for all your actions. He seems to think this is basic common sense. To act otherwise, he says, is to behave like a complete fool. Now, what seems self-evident to Aristotle is to us quite unintuitive, I think. We think it possible for someone to focus their lives on a single goal, and perhaps there are occasions on which we would admire a person like this. But we do not assume that deliberating with a view to one and the same goal throughout one's life is a matter of basic common sense. On the contrary, many people think this single goal style of reasoning is a very unreasonable way to proceed. A person with only one goal would be an obsessive maximizer of that good, and so would become a one-sided personality, blind to and lacking all the many intrinsically good things there are in life. Aiming at a single grand end seems unreasonable also because it fails to appreciate that there are reasons for action which have nothing to do with bringing some good into being. For example, the so-called backward-looking reasons of having made a promise. So, reasons for acting lie all over the place, in the past, in the future, here and there. So even before we hear Aristotle's own substantive proposal for what our target in life should be, we're liable to think that there's something weirdly obsessive and obtuse about the style or pattern of deliberation that he assumes as wise. Now, in speaking of the style of wise reasoning, I mean both that wise reasoning has a certain logical form, and also that that form can find imaginative expression in the images of the wise person pervasive in a culture. Images which, as Plato taught us so well, may both express and orient a philosopher's theorizing about practical reason. So, for example, I've said that Aristotle assumes that whatever the highest good turns out to be, it will be some single thing, and the wise person will deliberate by looking to it and will aim at it in every action, like an expert archer aiming at a target. The archer is an image of a teleological form of reasoning and action. Now, if Aristotle's picture of baseline reasonableness strikes us as bizarre, that's because I think we now tend to assume that the wise person identifies the variety of things that rightly matter to her, including, presumably, morality, and then tries to maximize and coordinate their pursuit so that efforts to achieve one good don't undermine the possibility of realizing others. So what image expresses the vision of the successful reasoner in our contemporary sense? Perhaps she's someone who balances or juggles. Perhaps our wise reasoner is more like a successful manager. And so the basic tool of having your act together isn't the bullseye, but the spreadsheet, the Outlook calendar, and the bucket list. Now, by contrast, on this way of thinking, the outright fool is one who, having multiple goals, gives no thought to time management, money management, and trade-offs. From this point of view, Aristotle's baseline sensible person looks odd indeed. She would be like someone who has only one item on her bucket list, someone who fills in every segment of her daily planner in the same color, with the same activity. Contemplation, contemplation, contemplation. Now, there's good reason to think, however, that Aristotle would himself find this picture of wisdom bizarre. In both the Eudemian ethics and the Nicomachean ethics, he argues that theoretical contemplation is the best human good, but he makes reasonably clear that the happy person also cares about justice and friendship, even though presumably these sometimes get in the way of contemplation. One might take this as evidence that, the archer image notwithstanding, Aristotle does not, in fact, believe that the wise person aims at only one target. Or perhaps as evidence that the target in question, eudaimonia, is in fact composed of proportionate quantities of many intrinsically good things. Now, I don't want to dispute those possibilities today. I don't agree with them, but I don't want to dispute them. Because regardless of whether Aristotelian eudaimonia is some kind of composite, I believe that the obsessiveness interpretation misunderstands what's implied in the first place by Aristotle's recommendation to deliberate with a view to a single end or target. That's to say, I think this interpretation gets it wrong about the style or form of Aristotelian deliberation. Now, the obsessiveness interpretation assumes that if a person acts with only a view to a single goal, then they seek to obtain more and more of that good without limit. And that's because, quite generally, the obsessiveness interpretation assumes that, for any given end, the only rational limitation on pursuit of that end is contingent. So, for example, if I established food as my one and only goal, but then you found me refusing more food, then that might be because my physiology happened to prevent me from eating more. It would be rational to eat more if I could, but I can't, and so it isn't. Or if the life of the mind is my only goal, but I take a break for a minute from thinking about Aristotle, then that must be because I'll faint otherwise. So I want to call this the consequentialist model of instrumental deliberation. It's a model according to which rational limitations on increasing the quantity of one's end are always contingent. My argument will be that this consequentialist model is deeply at odds with the theory of wise deliberation developed by Plato and Aristotle, a theory which they model on craft. Now, this isn't always easy to see, and that's because both the consequentialist model and Plato and Aristotle's craft model are models of instrumental teleological reasoning, the sort of reasoning which evaluates an agent's options in light of their conduciveness to bringing a desirable outcome or goal into being. And we might assume that the consequentialist model is the only form of a teleological account of wise deliberation could take. And that is, in fact, I think that's a view that you see, for instance, in Josh Ober's recent book about the Greeks and the invention of rationality. Nevertheless, despite the immense power of the consequentialist model, I believe that it provides a disorienting interpretive lens. In order to understand the craft model, we need to shift our sense of our sort of almost our aesthetic sense of what style of craft deliberation and practice is like. So it's here, I think, that the image of the archer can help. Because for the archer, the logic of aiming at a target is not the logic of aggregating as much of the goal as possible. Indeed, getting more is not even a coherent desideratum. The logic of archery is instead the logic of approaching a limit as closely as possible. So let's look at the beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics, where Aristotle's invocation of the archer as an image is even more explicit, and this is number 2 on your handout. So he says, if there is some end of things done which we want because of itself and want the others because of it, and if we don't choose everything because of another thing, for in this way it would proceed to infinity, and the result, that desire would be empty and vain, it's clear that this would be the good, that is to say, the best good. So doesn't knowledge of this hold great weight for life? And wouldn't we be just like archers with a target, more likely to hit on what we should? Now, the first thing to remind ourselves of is that Aristotle's comparison of the wise person to an archer is an inheritance from his intellectual culture. To be sure, it's part of the philosophical culture of the academy, So in the Republic, Socrates says that well-educated people, quote, have a single target in life at which all their actions, public and private, aim, stokadzamanus. And although I'm not sure where the historical hedonist Eudoxus stood on this issue, the fictional hedonist Philebus, in Plato's dialogue by that name, believes that pleasure is the good and therefore, quote, the correct target, skopos, at which every animal, quote, ought to aim. And that's stokadzesthai again. So Aristotle, Socrates, and Philebus may disagree with each other about what we should establish as our target, but they don't differ in assuming that the successful, wise person has some single target or other. It is this pervasive association of stokadzesthai, aiming in preparation for shooting or hurling, with skopos, something in view as a goal, which I'm calling the archer image or metaphor for intelligent action. Now, I know that pair of words could equally apply to throwing a javelin, but still it seems to me likely that in the context of discussions of wisdom, it's the archer who is the focal case of aiming. That's because the association of the archer with wisdom was already current before Plato. Maybe due in part to the similar shape of the bow and the lyre, there was a tradition in archaic poetry of comparing wise logos to an archer's arrows. In any case, in the passage we're considering now, Aristotle says explicitly that it's archers, toxotai, he has in mind. Now, several aspects of archery make it a fertile image of wise action, as Aristotle will theorize it. The archer stands at a distance from her target, a distance which is bridged by the application of her expertise. At least in military and hunting contexts, her target is in motion, and so too is the archer herself. What Aristotle draws to our attention here, though, is that the archer's goal may be in or out of view. I've always wondered about that. The archer who has a target as opposed to one who doesn't. What's the scene we're supposed to be imagining? Aristotle may be thinking, a la Iliad 23, of playing a game like skeet shooting, in which the archer stands in readiness for the target before it's visible. But more likely, I think, he's thinking of hunting, in which one must go to find one's quarry. If so, then the rest of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle is like a tracker who will bring the human good into view by defining it. And that idea, that sort of philosophical definition is like a hunter tracking its prey, is one that's familiar from Plato's Statesmen. So that's not as crazy as you might think. Or Aristotle might have in mind a military context, even though in some sense there's no question of whether or not he sees the mass of the enemy in general. The military archer might not yet see an appropriate individual to shoot at, and so would not yet have a skopos. So too, even though Aristotle's well-bred audience can recognize happy lives, they may not yet be able to identify what particular element in them is responsible for the goodness of the whole. When, on the other hand, the highest good is in view, that is, when the telos becomes a skopos, something seen, we, like the archer, will be more likely to hit what we already in some way know that we should. Now, once the archer sees her target, what can she do that she couldn't do before? How does seeing the target influence her thinking and behavior? To state the obvious, before seeing the target, the archer has no reason to shoot anywhere, and so can't shoot anywhere at all. As we'll see, Aristotle makes just this point about the necessity of the target for deliberation. Now, we'll look more closely at Aristotle's theory of deliberation in a minute, but for now, the archer image makes his point intuitively obvious. The practice of archery is not simply a matter of ejecting an arrow from a bowstring. It involves getting the straight edge of the arrow in line with the goal so as to hit it dead to rights. By the way, I had the most fun consulting with my brother-in-law, who is a bow hunter, to find out, like, how exactly do you do this? They use different bows now, but anyway, I thought some of it was applicable. Anyway, so you're trying to line up the arrow so that you can hit it straight on, but straight on is a relative term. Without the target, nothing counts as straight, and so the archer cannot even try to shoot. If she does let fly, she shoots randomly, which one could argue is just a foolish simulacrum of expertise. Now, you might protest that an experienced archer is able to draw on her experience so as to shoot, not at some particular place, but in the general vicinity of where she has seen game before. Now, that might not be foolish, but it would be desperate, and she would be hoping to get lucky. Once she sees the target, however, the archer is able to adjust her stance, a bit more to the left or the right, up or down. What I'm suggesting then is that having a target makes possible precision and determinacy of action, and related to that, rational control, rather than luck. The expert archer wants to hit the targeted spot exactly, and to do that, she must ensure that her arrow flies straight, and so she must be able to gauge exactly what to do. Now, the association of archery with accuracy and with the straightness of the well-shot arrow's path is natural and seems to me to be central to the archaic Greek conception of its excellence. So remember Odysseus, who has such superhuman ability that he can shoot the arrow straight through not only 1, but 12 axe heads. Now, interestingly, these associations are central when archery is used as a metaphor for good speech, too. So Pindar hopes to shoot straight, authus, and like an archer with a bow, to hit his target face on. That's in Nemean 6. By contrast with his rivals, whose song is garrulous, panglossia, Pindar's song is like an arrow hitting a target, saying all and only what needs to be said to manifest the gloriousness of the victories he praises. That's in Olympian 2. Likewise, Homer praises people for speaking straight to the point, like an archer striking a target, and not beating around the bush, as we would say. So Aristotle calls the rational thought, which guides and determines virtuous desire and action, the orthos logos, the straight logos. Now, I don't want to go so far as to say that he's deliberately evoking the archer image, but the phrase certainly resonates within that context. My main point, though, is that if the archer is an image of expertise in logos, success in reasoning and action is not simply a matter of achieving the goal, without regard for how you do it, or whatever other things you might hit along the way. It's a matter of achieving the goal fully, exactly, and in a manner that is elegantly economical. So nuanced adjustment, shooting straight, striking the goal precisely head-on, nothing extraneous, that's the style embodied by the expert archer and the wise agent alike. So the archer aims. She lets fly. She makes a clean hit. Will she shoot again? What a strange thing to ask. Why would she? She wanted to hit the target, and she has. The archer image is simply silent on the question of whether she shoots again. The logic of aiming at a target is not the logic of aggregating as much of the goal as possible. It's rather the logic of getting as close to the goal as possible. Now, proponents of the consequentialist model of instrumental reasoning will likely not be impressed with what I've just said. Because after all, they'll say, they are perfectly able to model the archer's form of action. If your goal happens to be delimited, then maximizing that goal will take the form of approximating to it as perfectly as possible. I mean, trying to achieve a value perfectly is just a form of maximization. This is why I think it's kind of hard to see what's the difference between this consequentialist model and the Kraft model. So, you know, the consequentialist model can just build in that, look, just as a contingent matter of fact, you can have a delimited target, and then reasoning will look like the archer. But what I want to emphasize in response is that the unity and delimitation of the archer's skopos is not contingent. There is no way to practice archery and thus there is no way to reason wisely as an archer unless the target is delimited and unified. A sharply delineated goal is what makes straightness of thought and action possible. Okay. So now, there's one important respect in which archery is a really bad model for practical wisdom, right? Expert archers aim and shoot intuitively on the basis of muscle memory and without conscious reflection. I mean, that's how you really do it. And you could make that mode of consciousness part of your theory of wisdom, and it seems to me that Confucius may do that, for instance. But Plato and Aristotle, it's no part of their conception of the ideal that you're not consciously deliberating. In fact, Aristotle says it takes a long time to deliberate. So it's not surprising that when Plato and Aristotle try to work out the details of their theory of practical wisdom, they usually turn to examples of other crafts: house building, medicine, lyre playing, navigation. So what I now want to show is that the archer's logic of delimitation, calibration, and precise approximation to a limit is very much to the point of the craft model more generally. Now, I'm in kind of a weird position here, because I expect that all of you, in a way, already know this. Everybody who's read Plato and Aristotle knows this. But maybe because our experience of craft occurs in a consumerist culture in which demand is both authoritative and infinitely pliable, or maybe because we live in an industrial society in which the crafts have been turned into something where there's just more and more put out on an assembly line, it seems to me that readers keep slipping into thinking of the craftsman as producing as much of the product as he can. So let's just take a quick look at some passages in Plato. Number 3 on the handout is from the Gorgias. Socrates, talking to Callicles, says, "Won't the good man act?" Actually, he says, "Won't the good man speak?" because he's talking about rhetoric, but I'm generalizing. "Won't the good man act, not randomly, but with a view to something, just like all the other craftsmen, each of whom keeps his own work in view, and so does not select randomly what he applies, but so as to give, but so that he may give his product a certain form. Each one places what he places into a certain organization and compels one thing to be suited and fit together with another until the entire object is put together in an organized and orderly way." And you can see something similar in the Republic in number 4. Now, according to Socrates, the craftsman as such, the person who doesn't act on the basis of wild guesses, but deliberately from knowledge, characteristically imposes order, molds and fashions her materials into parts that are suited to each other, and fits them together in such a way as to make a whole with a certain determinate form. So the goal of craft, the good result, is a product with a certain determinate form and structure. The Socratic craftsman is able to achieve this result because she looks to the form or essence of the product. You see that in number 4. So now, earlier in the Gorgias, Socrates claimed that there are 2 respects in which craft, that is, genuine productive knowledge, differs from mere facility based in experience. So unlike empiria, craft, quote, thinks about the best thing to achieve, and it understands, it can give a logos of the nature or cause of what it does. We can now see that the good which the craftsman thinks about and the cause or nature which she understands are the same thing. The form or essence of the good product is the cause, in the sense that it's the factor which logically determines what the parts of the whole product should be, how they should be related to each other, and precisely what steps the craftsman should take. Now, these ideas that craft is a power to benefit grounded in causal understanding are key points in the analogy between craft and practical wisdom, tout court. But described at that level of generality, Plato's model is the same as the modern consequentialist conception, since it too is intended to describe an attempt to achieve good on the basis of rational understanding of causes. Notice, however, that the sort of causal knowledge at issue in the consequentialist model is roughly knowledge of Humean constant conjunctions. That is, knowledge of what tends to result from what. If you do this, that's what will happen, or that's what's likely to happen. This qualifies as knowledge of the beneficial only derivatively. Humean causal knowledge enables the consequentialist deliberator to assemble an array of likely results of possible choices, but she then requires independent knowledge of the good in order to identify which result is the one that's best. But whereas a consequentialist reasoner's calculation of causes and likely effects can proceed without first knowing anything about the good, the Socratic craftsman's knowledge of his good product's form is the first principle of her calculation. Since the form or nature of the craft product determines what the parts must be, it serves as a cognitive standard in light of which the craftsman calibrates or measures the parts or stages of the developing product. So in a later dialogue, The Statesman, Plato suggests that the ability to measure in the sense of ascertaining and ensuring that something is neither too much nor too little, but in due measure, is of the essence of craft knowledge. And this is number 5 on your handout. I won't read it. Notice that craft knowledge is beneficial precisely because it instills a determinate limit into what is otherwise unlimited, a limit which is realized in the product as proportion and order. So this is number 6. There's not a single human being who doesn't know, Socrates says, that any kind of mixture that does not in some way or other possess measure or the nature or proportion the nature of proportion will necessarily corrupt its ingredients, and most of all itself. For there would be no blending in such cases at all, but really an unconnected medley, the ruin of whatever happens to be contained in it. I mean, don't you think, I find that a little hard to sympathize with Plato's idea that the constituents of the mixture are themselves benefited by being delimited. But I think it's easier to share his intuition that the product as a whole is good of its kind when its parts are well ordered, and that creating products of this sort is indeed characteristic of craft. So the order of interest to the craftsman is not mere structure, but appropriate structure, the determinate form the product takes when it's fitted to be used in whatever way it's by nature meant to be used. So for example, a couch is an implement for sitting on in company with others. By keeping in view this form, the carpenter selects and orders materials so as to make a couch that's good for sitting. And I mentioned this to some of you all yesterday in Frisbee Sheffield's class, but my great-grandmother had a horror of people who wallowed on the furniture. Right? And so she would really have hated the whole idea of the sectional sofa, which is a kind of sofa meant to be wallowed on. And Miles Bernier showed us that a similar anxiety about the proper symposiastic use of tables and couches motivates Socrates' discussion of the difference between mimesis and craft in Republic 10. Okay, so what I've been trying to show is that according to Plato's conception, this is number 7, craft looks to a target. The target is the form of the product it produces, understood as a limit. Craft realizes the targeted form in the materials on which it works by proportioning and limiting them, and the resulting well-ordered whole is good, good of its kind, good for use, and also, somewhat strangely, good for its constituents. Now, this idea that craft as such looks to the form of its product is perhaps the central point of the analogy that Plato draws between craft and virtuous wisdom. It's the linchpin of his argument against Callicles and the Gorgias that the intemperate person's disorderliness is a sign of ignorance. It's the linchpin of his argument against Thrasymachus in the Republic that the unjust person's unlimited graspingness marks them as lacking expertise. The temperate person's and the just person's respect for boundaries, which Callicles and Thrasymachus hold in such contempt, is in fact a sign of rationality, Socrates argues. Only a fool deliberates on the presumption that it's always better to get more of whatever good one has set as one's target. The wise person, like an expert, operates on the assumption that what she's trying to do is realizing a delimiting form. And once she achieves that, the only thing left for her to do is to preserve the determinate being that she's created. Now, this application of the craft model has immense ramifications for Plato's description of the wise and just person. So look at number 8. The just person puts himself in order, harmonizes the three parts of himself, like the three limiting notes in a musical scale, and becomes entirely one. And he calls the action just and fine that preserves this inner harmony and helps achieve it, and regards as wisdom the knowledge that oversees such action. So Socrates accepts the sophist's claim that wisdom is a sort of craft of living, and he uses the craft model to conclude that it's wise to live in such a way as to become one well-ordered, virtuous thing. Now, I'm emphasizing this because that the connection between craft and delimited goal is crucial to Plato's arguments, that it's wise to be morally virtuous. So that connection had better not be contingent. And in Plato's view, it's not contingent. Knowledge knows being. As Socrates puts it, knowledge is set over being. And so knowledge typically makes things that truly are what they are, at least as far as possible. For example, a master cobbler makes real shoes, not things that merely appear to be shoes or that play the role of shoes for only a short time. A real shoe has parts structured so as to enable it to protect the foot while walking, and precision in proportioning the shapes of the parts to each other and to the whole, and in fitting them together makes that structure stable. Orderly structure holds together the product as the object it is, and so makes it good of its kind. So what I'm suggesting is that according to Plato, there's an intrinsic connection between craft knowledge and delimited ordered products, because there's an intrinsic connection between delimitation and genuine stable being, which is the object of knowledge. A stable being is or has determinate form, and so knowledge must be a grasp of form and structure and order. Now, Aristotle's metaphysics differs from Plato's in significant ways, but on this point they are in agreement. According to Aristotle, substance is form and is conceived as a principle of delimitation and order. And so he thinks that knowledge is, in the first instance, a grasp of form. Now, true, Aristotle says that the craftsman and the natural scientist have to know matter. But what he means by that is that matter is a sort of potentiality for form. And so the craftsman knows his materials as things which are capable of being made up into something with a determinate structure. So it's because her goal is something like that that knowledge of it and rational action towards it is possible. This strikes me as a very significant difference from the consequentialist conception of instrumental reasoning. I mentioned before that according to that model, a reasonable person might happen to have a preference for a certain proportionality among her values, but this preference for delimitation is a purely contingent matter. It's not intrinsic to the very idea of practical rationality as such, that one's preferences be structured. Now, it's true that if you have multiple preferences, the consequentialist model requires some determinate ordering of them, since otherwise you wouldn't be able to calculate trade-offs. But this requirement emerges downstream of the consequentialist reasoner's starting point, which is first she selects, her goal is to select among the options open to her which one of them gets her as much as possible of whatever she wants. And ranking your preferences is just a good first step in getting as much as possible of whatever you want. By contrast, for Plato and Aristotle, craft deliberation is essentially an activity of knowing. And so, like all knowledge, it's a matter of grasping real being, that is, something with stable delimitation. And I think the same holds for their conception of rational wish. Reality, real goodness, is what rational beings desire and what they're able to know. Okay, so turning now to Aristotle, you might think that that's not the way Aristotle talks. He doesn't talk about looking to the form. He talks about looking to the end. But despite this, I think Aristotle does think of he agrees with Aristotle that the causal knowledge is knowledge of the craft product's form. Instead, what he's doing is clarifying that this form figures into deliberation as a goal and a normative standard. So in other words, the craftsman considers form as a final cause of the goodness of the things leading to it. And you can see this in number 9 on your handout. Okay, so Aristotle says that the teacher shows that the end is the cause of all that comes under it, for the teacher first defines the end and then shows each of the other things. I think you all have a different translation that comes under it. Okay. So you could look, 3 things I just want you to notice. First, students of practical topics such as medicine already have some experience, and so they are already able to identify health when they see it. So when Aristotle says that the teacher defines the end, he must mean that the teacher describes the healthy bodily condition in such a way as to bring into view the determinate character or structure that makes that condition count as health. So that's just to say that when the teacher defines health, she must be giving an account of the form or essence of health. So second, the teacher's point, Aristotle's point, is not if you happen to want health, then such and such things are worth choosing. His unhypothetical point is that health is good, and for that reason, the steps leading to it are good. And finally, the causal knowledge with which the teacher conveys is knowledge of why certain procedures are good. And that's a subtle difference from the consequentialist conception, but an important one. As I said before, the causes which the consequentialist reasoner knows are Humean constant conjunctions. If you do this, that's likely to happen. And the question of value doesn't come in until a later stage. For the Aristotelian craftsman, by contrast, the good result or goal is the primary cause, which explains why certain treatments are well calibrated, being neither too much nor too little. Exercising causal understanding and identifying the most beneficial treatment are one and the same rational act, in Aristotle's view. Now, practical knowledge for Aristotle is a deliberative ability, by which he means it's an ability to chart an effective path to your goal, when that path is not already evident in advance. My point has been that the goal is a cause, a final cause, in the sense that the goal's nature or form determines the character of everything that's genuinely a part of the path leading to it. So for this reason, a person who correctly apprehends the nature of the goal can use it as a standard for discovering and understanding which materials and techniques have the right beneficial shape. That's to say, the craftsman's knowledge of the goal gives her the power to deliberate, and that's exactly what Aristotle says in number 10 on your handout. The soul's deliberative power is its capacity to apprehend some cause, since that for the sake of which is one of the causes, and the last line, that is why those who have no target before them are not liable to deliberate. It's important for our purposes to realize that not every desired result serves as a cause of goodness in the sense we've been exploring. So take, for example, resurfacing a road, which when I was started writing this paper, I was watching this happening outside my window. It looks like very hard work. You have to rake the hot asphalt so that it's level and in the right places. You can't glue the manhole covers in place and so forth. And that work will strengthen your muscles, which may improve your health and will also might excite the admiration of a sedentary academic looking from the apartment window next door. But these results, the workman's health, the admiration of a sedentary academic, however desirable they may be, do not determine the proper technique for resurfacing a road. The road builder's movements are an example of resurfacing a road. That is just what they are. And unless interrupted, they will unfold in a manner that culminates in a new road. The worker's movements are good as what they are when they are perfectly calibrated so as to achieve that result. Strong muscles and admiration are just merely contingent. Now, again, this points to a significant difference between Aristotle's craft model and the consequentialist model. If the road worker is a consequentialist reasoner, standing on the unsurfaced road, she will consider the various options before her. First step, she limits them to those which will involve resurfacing the road, because after all, she wants a paycheck. That's one of the things she wants. But now suppose that some of the ways of resurfacing the road will build her strength, while others don't. From the point of view of the craft model, building strength is just irrelevant, and thought of it would be a distracting intrusion into her deliberation. But for a consequentialist reasoner, there is, in principle, no result beyond the limits of her consideration. Even if a result is completely irrelevant to the task of building a road, it may be on her bucket list, and so she should try to get it if she can. Now, I want to pause here for a moment. I said at the beginning that one of our modern images of practical wisdom is the bucket list. A bucket list is a jumble of must-dos, like climb Machu Picchu, learn the tango, eat in a 3-star Michelin restaurant. There is no internal unity to the bucket list. And that's true even when they have a theme. If you Google them, you'll see they sometimes do. That means that bucket list deliberation is ever open to distraction by the apprehension of some new, unrelated consideration. An Aristotelian telos, by contrast, is a unity. Even if it's complex, its parts are determined by the nature of the whole. And so there is a coherence and unity to the thought and action leading to it. And I ask you just to reflect on the quality of your own instrumental deliberation. Is it distracted and ever fragmented, or does it have the unity of the craftsman? Okay, so if you look at number 11 and 12, I've given a couple of examples of Aristotle talking about the goal figuring as setting a boundary or a limit. So in number 12, he's talking about the boundary of wealth in sort of home economics. And what he says about all the crafts is that the number, size, and instruments are limited by the good product which is proper to the craft to produce. And so Aristotle suggests that what limits the amount of wealth is eudaimonia. However much is needed for that is precisely the amount we should seek. Now, I want to say that I don't think goals could play that function if they were not themselves limited ways of being. Not limited in the sense of being limited from the outside, but limited in the sense of being a determinate unity. They have to be limited in order to make it the case that we can then infer what precisely is the amount that we need. So I think an exception that proves the rule is Aristotle's discussion of the art of money-making. He thinks that's a bizarre kind of a craft because moneymakers pursue wealth in a way that's unlimited. There's no such amount that more wouldn't be better. But Aristotle thinks that just goes to show that their conception of wealth has been decoupled from the nature of what wealth is. They have objectified, made a goal of the conventional sign of wealth, which is coin, and they pursue it in place of the wealth that it signifies. And so they've therefore lost the rational connection to an objective stopping point. Okay, so I now want to move on just very briefly to Aristotle's discussion of practical wisdom, tout court, and with it the problem of aiming at a single target throughout one's life. Aristotle draws a sharp distinction between craft and phronesis because he draws a sharp distinction between production, which brings into being an object beyond the action, and praxis, action proper, whose end is in itself. So for an intuitive sense of praxis, think about somebody dancing a waltz. The person who's dancing a waltz is always aiming for an ideal, but it's an ideal that's embodied in the activity of dancing with every step that they take. And that's what praxis in general is like. Aristotle says that the end in light of which practical wisdom deliberates is eudaimonia, but more specifically, it's the way of acting that appears good to virtuous desire. As he says, virtue makes the target, the skopos, correct. But what is it that appears good to the virtuous agent? Interestingly, for our purposes, when Aristotle attempts to define virtuous desire, he argues that it's like craft in that it targets a precisely calibrated meson, or intermediate. And that is, what is that, number 14 on your handout, which is a well-known passage, and I won't read it. But just notice the echoes of the Platonic craftsman. The virtuous person aims at a target, and that target is the intermediate. The steps she takes embody that intermediate along a number of dimensions, at the right time, the right place, the right manner, and so forth. And the result is an action with the equilibrium of a well-proportioned whole, needing nothing to be added or taken away. And there's a lot we could say about that passage. But what I want to point out is that by describing the goal of moral virtue as he does, Aristotle is making an argument in favor of his claim that the virtue of the desiring, emotional part of the soul is, in a way, a rational excellence. Even though virtuous desire and emotion are not themselves acts of reasoning, the goal at which they aim and the actions they produce have intelligible structure. The sheer complexity of this well-proportioned whole is a mark of its being generated by knowledgeable cognition, keeping its eye on delimiting due measure. And that is, in fact, the point of Aristotle's concluding definition of virtue, number 15 on your handout. The intermediacy targeted by virtuous desire and realized in virtuous decisions and actions is the very sort which knowledge knows. Once again, there is a necessary, not a contingent, relation between knowledge and the delimitation of the goal. So in Aristotle's view, the virtuous intermediate functions as sort of an extreme point beyond which there is no more good to be achieved. And to explain this point, he draws once again on the image of the archer. This is number 16 on your handout. He says it's possible to miss the mark in many ways, for badness belongs to the class of the unlimited, and the good to the class of the limited, while it's possible to keep straight in only one way, for which reason one is easy and the other difficult. To fail to hit the mark easy, to hit it difficult. So like an expert archer, the virtuous, wise person shoots straight at the target and hits it precisely head on. Aristotle allows that some deviations may still count as good, but only when they approach near enough to the center point. Teleological reasoning, as Aristotle conceives it, is an attempt to approximate to the ideal insofar as circumstances allow. That's the case both in craft and practical wisdom, tout court. And so there's an interesting example of this point at the beginning of Politics 4, where Aristotle begins his investigation of non-ideal constitutions. And I'll just look at the very bottom of that. He says it belongs, this is number 17, it belongs to the same kind of knowledge to study what the topic is and of what sort it would be if it were most in accord with one's wishes and had no external impediments. And also, it belongs to the same art to study what form is suited to what people, since it's perhaps impossible that many would achieve the best one. So he's saying, it belongs to the same art both to know what the ideal constitution is and to know what's ideal given our very imperfect circumstances. And the reason it belongs to the same kind of knowledge to know both is that you understand deviations in light of the best case. Okay, so just to conclude, to come to sort of the question of contemplation and whether we should be maximizing it as the highest good. At the end of the Eudemian Ethics, Aristotle says that whatever, this is number 18, whatever choice and acquisition of natural goods will most effectively produce contemplation of God, that is the best, and this is the finest limit. Now, what would it be to aim at contemplation like an expert archer? It's tempting to interpret the malista there as qualifying the amount of population. But really, as Inwood and Wolff correctly translate, what it means is especially. If we take our cue from the archer metaphor then, so it seems to me, Aristotle's point is about making every choice with an eye to contemplation. It's not about increasing the quantity of that good, but is instead about achieving and sustaining an ideal as perfectly as possible. Now, doesn't that mean, though, that de facto the wise person contemplates all the time or for as long as she can? After all, God's continuous contemplation is most perfect. That's true. God's continuous contemplation is the ideal. But the value of continuity is not the sheer length of time. Action is like dancing a waltz, carried along by the pleasure inherent in attaining the goal at every moment that one dances. The value of continuity in contemplation, as in waltzing, is simply that a good activity is not interrupted. But that sort of contemplation isn't possible for us. So even though continuous contemplation is an ideal, we must consider how to achieve this ideal in our circumstances. For us, it might well be, and Aristotle thinks it is, that contemplation with friends is more perfect, more continuous than what we can achieve on our own. If the sustained and fruitful human activity of contemplation depends on institutions and political community, then aiming to perfect this end may well orient the wise deliberator to contributing to a community in which she and others can participate in this good. That's to say, aiming at contemplation like an expert, but imperfectly situated archer, involves shifting one's stance in the sense of aiming to contemplate with others, and thus undertaking actions that will promote their ability to enjoy this good life activity insofar as they're able. Now, I don't claim that this is indubitably the right answer, but my point is just that properly understood, the craft model leaves that open and indeed invites such a thought. After all, the archer does not always take the first shot. Thank you.